From beautiful downtown Milwaukee, the mecca of mythicism, it's the Mythicist Milwaukee Show, keeping the all-seeing eye of Horus on the secular movement. Produced weekly by Mythicist Milwaukee and sponsored by Atheist Community of Milwaukee, Kenosha Racine Atheists and Freethinkers, and King's Tower Productions. The Mythicist Milwaukee Show highlights movers and shakers from the global secular movement and explores the mythic origins of today's major religions.
Welcome back to the Mythicist Milwaukee Show. Today I'm a special guest host, Antonio, and with me is Brian, my normal podcast host. Mythicist Milwaukee produces a weekly podcast focused on free thought and secular topics. You can see Mythicist Milwaukee at mythicistmilwaukee.com. We research and educate the free thought community about the parallels between religion and mythology. Also, you can invest with Mythicist Milwaukee through a subscription, and we are also on Patreon. Patreon assists us in being able to bring you fantastic shows such as this on a weekly basis. Well, with that, we have today Melissa Chen. Melissa Chen is a biotech professional by day and secular activist by night, though sometimes that order is switched. She runs the global secular humanist movement, which has 370,000 subscribers, and together with its founder, Faceall Saeed Al-Mutar, she is launching a new nonprofit called Ideas Without Borders. She was born in Singapore and immigrated to the U.S., where she reads genetics and computational biology in college and grad school. So welcome today, Melissa.
Hi. Hello, everybody. Thank you for having me, Fritz and Brian.
Good. And you're a graduate of Boston University. Did I hear that right? And where did you go to graduate school?
I went to MIT.
Very good. So you share an alum with Jenna Marbles, who's one of my favorite comedians online. She often cries up next to her Boston master's degree.
Yeah, I just saw this out on the tribute to Boston, and they called Cambridge and MIT it's like heaven for people who don't believe in heaven, and it's really true.
So what are you doing now? I know that the Global Secular Humanist Movement, you're editor and helping to run that. Is that your full-time job, or do you have a day job in genetics or anthropology?
Yeah, no, I do have a day job now, and I am working for a biotech company. It was kind of hard, actually, looking for biotech jobs after grad school, because I think if you've been vocal about certain incendiary topics online, say if you're critical about Islam or you post stuff that was anti-religion, people generally look up your social media feed.
Yeah, and
I've definitely experienced some weird questioning during the hiring process. So I've been always very careful to separate the two, especially now that we're being sort of being a lot more. We're living in times that are a lot more politically correct. So that's something that I tend to be very careful about. But yeah, I am working right now in biotech in the capacity of it's actually glorified technical sales. That's what I would call it. With a genomics company.
Awesome. And we'll talk more about like the PC culture coming up, but tell us about the Global Secular Humanist Movement and where that is since its founding. Like, tell us a little about what you do. I know that you guys are looking for money, some of the successes and problems you're having.
So the Global Secular Humanist Movement was actually started by Faceall Saeed Al-Mutar, who is he right now is a Iraqi refugee, lives in the United States. And he works as a human rights activist in New York City. But he actually started this page when he was back in Iraq, when he was in Baghdad in 2009. And it's grown. I mean, back then in 2009 in Iraq, being secular, being not Muslim, was already a radical enough position. And he's grown that page and has a following of till today, like. The public page has about 370,000 subscribers, and his personal profile has grown over the years. He's been invited to speak at various conferences, secular atheist conferences around the United States. And then he started going into human rights because, to him, the question of whether God exists or not became boring, almost intellectually just boring. So instead of just sort of parading around the atheist conference circuit, well, the next question was, all right, so there's no God. What do we do about it? What are the actual issues that we can focus our efforts on? And the answer for him was human rights. So him and, well, actually me too, have been pivoting away from that, the atheist arena.
And how did you encounter Faceall? Was this something that you were always interested in and he found you, or did you find him?
So he came to Harvard. He gets to speak in some of the most renowned institutions around the world. And he got an invitation in about 2014 to speak at Harvard. And I managed to organize a dinner for him, sort of put together an event where a lot of his followers and fans from Cambridge, from MIT, could meet up. And he was sort of impressed with, I guess, my organizational effort. And we started talking from there. That was the first time I met him. And he calls it the keys to his baby, his car, because he was the only person running it at the time. And he said, I kind of need some help. So that's how that relationship started. And we found ourselves to be completely ideologically aligned. There was, nothing I can almost guess what he would think on any one issue. So that really helps when you're working with someone.
And car, it seems to be an apt analogy because he told me that and I've seen this on the Rubin Report, that he described being an atheist in a majority Muslim country as being the only sober person in the car full of drunk people and not being able to drive or not being allowed to drive, which I thought was great. And so we've given you the keys to this car, and then do you create all the posts on global secular humanism, or are you actually running the efforts sometimes to get some of the beleaguered folks, the secular folks, out of countries and help them emigrate? Like what exactly are you shooting at?
So both of that effort. So the feed is really, what that allows us to do is we see that more as a education, right? So we're promoting a public understanding of a secular humanistic worldview. And we're engaging people who identify as secular humanists from around the world. One of the main issues I found with many of the atheist or humanist pages and foundations in the U.S. was they were very focused on domestic issues. So even the American Humanist Association, like a lot of their work is focused domestically, which rightly so. It's in their name. It's American Humanist Association. But we wanted to sort of step back and draw from the more global perspective. I mean, that's because, he came from Iraq, Faisal is from Iraq, and I was from Singapore. We wanted people knowledgeable about international affairs and what's happening on this front. Where do you have religions around the world sort of trampling on civil liberties, on human rights, because we feel that a lot of the problems of infighting in the secular humanist or even atheist movement has been from people too focused on domestic issues to the point where they've really let go of some sort of global perspective, right? So that's why you have situations where people who are, say, they would really like to critique Islam but they're afraid of it because they might be labeled racist or, so that I think comes from a place where we sort of moved to this, first world problems now. And we're arguing about whether costumes are racist and things like that.
Yeah.
And we thought, so this posting, articles from around the world, like maybe you don't think, you rarely think about what's happening, say right now in Ethiopia, free speech is being quite actively assailed. But knowing what's happening in all these like faraway lands helps us weave a narrative that's actually very, very different from what a lot of the domestic issues are.
That's great. And as Faisal said, women are being given the keys to drive within the secular caliphate. So it seems you're doing a great job with that. Are you also connected in any way, not to diverge too much from your work, but are you connected in any way to his movements.org passion as well?
Yes. I am. And in part, that's what we're going to be doing moving forward with, we really like this name. We were thinking of, we always wanted to start our own actual nonprofit. And, the people, at Movements, which is basically, an app, a mobile app that connects people in closed societies who are under persecution. We're talking about people under political persecution or religious persecution. We connect them, dissidents, to people in open societies, like, in the West, people who have skills that can help them. Or a translator, if you know how to speak, say, Bengali and English, if you have connections to, journalists and you can get some of their writings published, or even you're a human rights lawyer, or willing to sort of, put in some effort as a human rights lawyer pro bono, we can all sort of help these people who are being persecuted for just simply expressing their views, or just simply by just existing. Maybe they're a gay person living in Saudi Arabia. Help their cause in whatever way it is. Sometimes it is to get out of the country when their life is in threat. Other times it's really just exposing these views, these stories that would never be covered under normal circumstances, because, they lack the proper connections or they're speaking the wrong language. So that's what Movement does. It's basically, it's not Tinder. It's more of a Match.com for people in the West who are interested to help, the people that we say we're all fighting for, and vice versa, to help the people who are in trouble, whatever it is, whether it is to immigrate to to find a safe haven in the West, or to, help their cause wherever they live.
Right. You mentioned specifically that, and this is great, even just, it seems to me, even if you had a person just feeling alone and you have a way to connect, it would be good for that. And I think it's much broader. But going back to your global secular humanist, you mentioned specifically being from Singapore, and Singapore having lots of hate speech laws or blasphemy laws, to where you can't say anything about Islam, but they can't say anything negative about Christianity, and so on and so forth. And I think your words were, it gives the facade of tolerance, it gives the facade of harmony, but really these government restrictions on speech can be so broad that the government itself can stop them, or can be immune from criticism. And you said that that's played into politics. Can you tell us how? Because I don't think a lot of Americans are aware of what's going on in Asia.
Well, so, Singapore is a very young country, got independence in 1965. And a lot of, it's achieved really, it's been a miracle in terms of looking at human development. It's gone from third world to first world in barely 3 decades. So, it doesn't really fit into any of the world's categories. It's a benevolent dictatorship. There's no corruption. People enjoy prosperity, a lot of affluence there. But a lot of policies that curb civil liberties in Singapore are pushed under the pretext of maintaining this fragile equilibrium that is social harmony. So there's severe lack of free speech. But this harmony is very Orwellian, because there's these out of bounds markers to speech, what you can and cannot say. And a lot of it is, it was government instituted, but the problem is that over time, you end up, because you're so afraid of the government sort of crossing these imaginary lines. I always say it's kind of like a landmine. You really don't know you've crossed the line until it blows up,
right,
which is way too late. So, you have a 17-year-old blogger by the name of Amos, who I'm acquainted with right now. He has been thrown into jail twice. The first time for wounding the religious feeling of Christians, and the second time for wounding the religious feelings of Muslims. And this is the actual charge that was thrown at him, for which he was jailed. He is still serving his sentence right now, and it's very indicative of the kind of sinister controls of speech that's going on. You have also these things called like the Newspaper and Printing Presses Act in Singapore. It allows the government to basically grant annual licenses. So if you want to publish anything for circulation, you need to get a license from the government. And it has the authority to gazette any foreign publication and restrict their circulation. Many foreign publications have been, if they are found to have meddled in Singaporean affairs politically, the New York Times, the New York Post, in fact, and I think the Far Eastern Economic Review, till today, the latter, the Far Eastern Economic Review is banned in the country. You can't even get it. So this is the kind of controls of free speech that I sort of got used to growing up there. And freedom of the press is also an issue. There's not really I think the Reporters Without Borders does this ranking every year. They rank the extent of freedom of press in various countries. Out of 180, Singapore is 154. And it's below Russia. It's below Afghanistan and Libya. So that just gives you an idea of how a country can be number 1 or 2 in terms of, GDP per capita in the world, but 154 out of 180 in terms of freedom of press. So the question is, what are they so afraid of? I've never really understood that. I think a lot of it was just a guise to push certain, to maintain control. So if you sort of, say that, society, our racial harmony is so fragile, because, there are so many, different groups, disparate groups of different ethnicities, religions living in Singapore. And very harmoniously, it would seem on the surface, there hasn't been any, issues. And radical Islam also hasn't really taken root very strongly in Singapore, because the government does control speech very well.
Gotcha.
So it's an interesting setup, and leaving that country and coming here, I thought, I was so drawn to this ideal of free speech. The First Amendment is enshrined in our Constitution, and I was so excited, and I felt free in that sense, because I was an atheist growing up in a sort of a conservative religious circle in Singapore, going to religious schools. So for me, that idea of free speech, the idea of, say, like a safe space, was a space that's safe from the government policing my speech. And then I got here, and the people calling for a safe space it's a totally different concept of what a safe space is. In fact, they want to impose a boundary of what you can and cannot say.
And I noticed that while you were at the Reason Rally, your focus on posting for Amos Yee. Did I pronounce his last name correctly?
Yes. I did. You did, yeah.
So that was something that I noticed was going prevalent for you. Was that one of your platforms, or one of the reasons that you went to Reason Rally, was to create a platform to make us aware of his situation?
Well, partially. I think I tried doing it there because Amos actually had a huge following in the atheist or secular community. The Richard Dawkins Foundation blasted his case on social media when he got arrested the first time for insulting Christians. Actually, yeah. So that's kind of, he got a lot of fans and followers for his YouTube channel, and I knew that majority of Westerners who gave a shit about Amos's case was going to be the atheist community, because here is a young person who's basically being persecuted for his views on religion in a supposedly secular country. He was actually also charged for sedition because he insulted a political leader who had just passed away. In the end, those charges were dropped, and the only ones that stuck were the charges for him, insulting feelings, like wounding feelings. The wording of those charges just gives me the creeps. It's so Orwellian.
Yeah, for a dead politician, that's incredible.
Right, exactly. So yeah, that's the reason why I did it at the Reason Rally, was because that was his platform. Most people, if you ask, say, like a conservative Christian in America, probably wouldn't care to fight for his right to speak freely, because they're on the same side. That was, why would you fight for somebody who's mocking your views, right? It's almost, there are some principled, Christians and, say, Muslims in America who understand the value of free speech, I think, and who would agree with it, but they're really in the minority.
Mm-hmm. Now, I'd seen that you had recently gone back to Singapore with some high-profile speakers. Is that correct?
Yeah, Professor Jerry Coyne from the University of Chicago. I always considered him the fourth horseman after Christopher Hitchens passed away.
Right.
So he actually, I got him to go to Singapore and to do this speaking tour there, where he spoke at the National University of Singapore and Yale NUS College. Yale has a satellite campus in Singapore, which was interesting because it caused a lot of there was a bit of a controversy back on Yale campus in the U.S. because a lot of the well-minded liberal students and faculty were saying, why is Yale prostituting its name to a government that has such a poor human rights record? So they were not, they were acting on principle, and they were upset that Singapore even has a Yale campus there. But I think that, if you want to educate a population, that's kind of the way to do it, right? You get your education system into that country, and slowly you can start bringing your principles and to the population, to the local. And hopefully that'll change.
That makes a lot of sense. And it's so important in the USA to not think within our borders, because there's so many more people out in the world. And specifically going into Southeast Asia again, in Indonesia, the Supreme Court's going to be looking at revoking the rights for gays and making actually homosexual relations illegal. And it's going to go down to the Supreme Court. And in Aceh province, specifically too, they're allowing a certain amount of Sharia punishments.
Correct,
can you tell us more about this and what you can potentially do to help?
Yeah, it's creeping. This is Indonesia. It's Reza Aslan's bastion of moderate Islam, and where he claims that women are just as equal as men. So that's the picture that Reza would like to paint. In Southeast Asia, it's not just Indonesia. Brunei has a very severe case of
yes.
I mean, it's not even creeping Sharia now. Brunei is just Sharia law.
Sharia, yeah.
Completely. It seems that conservative or this strain of Islamism it appears to be taking root. In part, I think this notion and the founder of Singapore, the first prime minister, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, who really successfully built a nation from scratch. He had one dangerous legacy for me, and that legacy is positing that there's this notion of Asian values that it has to be respected, and it's usually posited against Western values. So under this construct, values such as privileging the community over the individual, respect for authority, they are dichotomized against Western values such as individualism. Yep. So basically what he's saying is that Asian societies have their own way of doing things. Western ideas are invalid and tend to be illegitimate within Asian societies. So there's this binary logic, right? And it's legitimizing many repressive policies and actions that can be passed off under the guise of Asian values. This has been happening you start to see it even now with the Philippines, which is also considered Southeast Asia, where they're basically pushing back against, the West and saying like, you know what, you do things your way. I know how to solve the drug problem. I'm just going to go out into the street extrajudiciously, murder drug lords or suspected drug lords with no due process. And the justification of this is we know what's best because we're in Asia. Your values of human rights and whatever it is, it doesn't work here. And the same thing is happening in these countries that are majority Muslim in Asia, especially in Southeast Asia, where Indonesia is the largest Muslim country. People forget that sometimes. It's not in the Middle East. Mm-hmm. What used to be kind of a syncretic, they used to have a more syncretic blend of Islam that, because it adapted, to local traditions, the Javanese Buddhism and all that stuff. And we just cannot ignore the fact that the Islamists are having a stronghold now, and they are gaining influence. Recently, you saw the protests happening in Jakarta, where thousands on the streets of Jakarta protesting because of a governor, so one of the candidates, who was Christian and who was Chinese. They were protesting against him for purportedly saying something blasphemous. And it was the most innocuous thing you can imagine, but that somehow managed to draw out thousands of people.
So what is it like for you to go back to Singapore, being such a vocal advocate for individualism and free speech. Do you find yourself censoring yourself because you have to, you know your surroundings, similar to the connection that you made, how your recent job prospects, they had to look back into your personal profile to see kind of like who you're about in your private life. Did you find yourself being nervous in any way, going with Jerry Coyne, or are you just are you just yourself when you're out there?
It's interesting, actually. Lalo Degash, who is this and all over Twitter, and he was on the Dave Rubin Report. He actually told me once. He said that being critical about Islam or having tweeted anything that's critical about religion, and especially Islam, it's almost worse than doing porn. You might as well have done porn in your life, and it's out there, because the way people look at you, and it's not just cost professionally, it's also a cost socially. Sometimes your family members are like, why can't you just shut up on this? Like, why do you have to make a lot of these are uncomfortable truths, and sometimes when you highlight it, people get really uncomfortable. So he totally got that analogy. I know exactly what Lalo meant. It is like doing porn, in a way. Like, in fact, I think maybe even nowadays doing porn is a bit more accepted.
Perhaps, yeah.
In Singapore, we weren't sure at first, do we need to apply for a permit for Jerry? Because if Jerry came to speak, he was invited and hosted by the Humanist Society of Singapore. And, these people, like, the amount of barriers they have to fight, bureaucratic or otherwise, just to exist as an organization is insane. Jerry was invited by them. And at first we weren't sure, should we apply for a permit for him to speak? It turns out if you're speaking on a university venue, you don't really need to apply for a permit. But let's say the Humanist Society just invited him to speak as a guest. They were renting out, say, an auditorium or a lecture hall somewhere that's not on a university campus, then they would have had to apply for a permit for Jerry to speak. And I don't know if it would have been granted because, Jerry is a new atheist. He has criticized religion many times. He has books that are outright critical of religion. So when we were there, I think I totally avoided talking about Amos. I totally avoided. I wasn't there speaking. I wasn't the one speaking. So it was people in the university that have said that there are things that exist right now on my social media feeds that I've posted that are outright seditious. Like, for example, I drew a cartoon of Prophet Muhammad on Draw Muhammad Day. That in and of itself I'm liable for arrest. Technically, every time I step, across that border, I'm liable for arrest, because that is something that if Amos was arrested for wounding the religious feelings of Muslims. Even if it happened outside of Singapore? Correct. And that there is precedent on that. Recently, a few months ago, there was an Australian woman who ran a website called therealsingapore.com, and she was arrested and thrown into jail for things that she had written while in Australia about Singapore. So the moment she landed in Singapore, she was visiting her husband, who is Singaporean. She got arrested, and she's now in jail, actually.
Well, it's interesting how you mentioned like the Asian values and in opposition to Western values. And I see that they're getting quite a bit mixed up, because there's plenty of people here living in the West that don't like the word Western values and tend to use illiberal thought, almost like what you said, collectivism over individualism. What do you think about like kind of the eroding of this? And some people would kind of pejoratively call it the regressive left, but what are your thoughts on how this plays into kind of culture in general, and maybe to the election afterward we can get into?
I think that first and foremost, that's coming from a place of this doctrine of cultural relativism, right? That's where this notion of, I don't understand how you can subscribe to any form of cultural relativism and yet still hold that, everybody hold to the idea of universal human rights, because they're completely inconsistent. Either you believe that everyone born, regardless of creed or background, deserves the same rights the same, human dignity, the same level of human dignity. Or you believe that no, you know what, there should be exceptions to the case, because that's what relativism is asking us to see. It's asking us to see that, there are local cultural traditions that should be, sort of exception. It's exceptionalism. It's basically, it's premised on the idea that all cultures are basically equally valid.
Mm-hmm.
And we should be able to look at cultures around the world and say, you know what, this is a cultural practice that we should stand up to, that violates human decency or dignity. And sort of like putting these like boundaries in cultures into boxes and saying like, okay, no, these are values that are Western versus Asian, but pitting that against each other is basically ceding to cultural relativism, which is so harmful for this idea of human rights. And I don't know how some people can sort of square that peg.
Yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense. It's directly in opposition to, human rights. You cannot have laws in the books that say, we're going to hang you if you're a gay man, and claim, but our culture should deserve the same respect. Those things they're in opposition, no doubt. How do you feel like this may have affected current American politics? Your Twitter, you have an awesome quote. I just have to use it. You said, liberals have overused the antibiotics of shame and thus bred antibiotic resistant Trump supporters. Identity politics is cancer. That's brilliant.
Well, someone pointed out that I was mixing two different metaphors, two different analogies, because cancer versus infectious disease. And that's true.
We'll give you a pass.
They were holding me to my scientific inaccuracy there. But the shame issue is it has been creeping up, right, in the past few years with the sort of what we're seeing on college campuses, with PC culture, and it's widespread.
Yes, it is.
Than it was when I was in college, at least. This idea that, anyone who sort of steps out some boundary, whether it's a costume or, a certain act, like, the fact that you could define, say, like, some people were writing the word Trump in chalk, and that would traumatize people. And that in and of itself, just being a Trump supporter was deemed racist, was deemed, complicit. And that's dangerous, because we're not even listening to why, like, those people because there was a wave of these like incidents where Trump was somehow written on the public spaces on campus, and that triggered students, and the police had to be called in. But instead of being triggered by this, by the word, I don't understand why we didn't engage with Trump supporters early on and ask, okay, well, why do you support Trump? Because a lot went unchecked. And then when the news reports of these things started coming out, and again, these were all reported by it reaches the mainstream media later. But at first, like, you always have the college fix picking up things like that, because, and they're a bit, right-wing news channel where they focus on college issues. Heat Street does it, which is an arm of the Wall Street Journal. So you have these like sort of a bit more partisan publications picking it up. Eventually, when there's enough outrage, then you'll see the Washington Post pick it up. Sometimes the New York Times does, especially when they had the case of the Oberlin College students who were
the sushi,
who said that sushi was cultural appropriation. Bad sushi or inauthentic pad thai was cultural appropriation.
I'm glad you're talking about this, because cultural appropriation is something that I would really like to hear your thoughts on, because yoga is now cultural appropriation, and I am racist if I partake in that.
I really don't understand where this came from. I actually think that, I think I said this before too, that this sort of anger about, cultural appropriation and especially white people doing it, is coming from a place where they're trying to punish people for the sins of their fathers, almost.
Yes.
It's like, I've seen also like a lot of Asian Americans say like, when I was young and I brought my weird Asian food to school, my school lunches, because, you all brought your box lunch. And I was made fun of and teased for the smelly stuff that I brought and the weird looking noodles. So, now I'm going to punish those people, because now it's right. It's hip to eat, or it's exotic cuisine is now completely mainstream. But now they want revenge. They want revenge for that early smearing of their food or early bullying. That's what it seems to me. It seems to be a reaction born out of this. I'm going to make them pay. I'm going to make them pay back for these experiences that I had.
Yeah.
And it's not intellectually honest either. Lionel Shriver, the author who did this amazing speech at the Sydney Writers' Festival on cultural appropriation, she asked very pointedly, culture, who are you to own it? How about writing other people's stories? Because now there's this accusation that if you are not white and you write a story, a narrative about, say, from the perspective of a Black girl growing up in the inner city, that has drawn accusations now of cultural appropriation.
I thought the whole point of being multicultural was to put yourself in others' shoes so you can understand them better.
Exactly, but they don't see it that way. They're starting to see it like you're hijacking their narrative to sound interesting, because you know what? White culture, white people, you're boring. You have no culture. I've heard that so many times. And also as an immigrant, right? That a lot of my fellow immigrants, Europeans sometimes, would say, yeah, Americans have no culture. That's one of the weirdest criticisms I've ever heard about the United States. But it's very, very common.
Right.
And that's where that comes from. It's like Americans have no culture, so they're just appropriating the more interesting narratives of, an Afghani boy and or something going through war. It's gotten really ridiculous now, because what they're favoring with this kind of appropriation nonsense is complete balkanization.
Yes.
Of culture. We used to be weren't we supposed to aim for this society where race just doesn't matter? But in the end, what we're doing is we're reinforcing cultural or racial boundaries, because culture is race in this country. Isn't the first step to understanding another culture participating in it?
Absolutely.
And to embrace it. The Japanese, I don't know whether you guys heard of Kimono Gate. It happened at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, the MFA in Boston. It's a painting by Monet of this beautiful. It's a portrait of his wife, and they were showcasing this beautiful painting. She was wearing a kimono. So as part of this exhibit, they said, okay, well, we're going to do, kimono, try on a kimono Wednesday. And that kimono was a replica of the one in the painting. So they invited people to the museum, come try it out, take a picture in it. And it's a stunning, piece of fabric. And many people started visiting, and they were doing that. They were taking pictures. And of course, you had social justice warriors saying, that's appropriation. You're basically using Japanese culture for entertainment. So there were mass protests, not that big, but there were protests that drew enough attention. The Boston Globe covered it. It ended up all the way to the New York Times. What's funny was a few days ago, I was going by. I had a layover in Narita Airport and in Japan, in Tokyo. At the airport itself, there was a booth called "Try on a Kimono" to take pictures, and it was done by the Japanese people because they love it. They rent out kimonos just by the hour. You can go to Kyoto or different parts of Japan, try on or for a certain nominal fee. At the airport, it was for free because they're really trying to reach out to tourists to showcase Japanese culture. But for other cultures, like the Japanese themselves, they are appreciative when people, they love it when foreigners try on their culture just because they see that as it's flattery. It's like you're interested. And how dare these people who have, some of them white people, some of them Asian Americans, not even Japanese, so you have Chinese Americans, be upset about this notion of, trying on a kimono. It's like you're not even upset correctly on the behalf of Japanese people who love it. This is a common practice in Japan where they get people to try on their culture and just to walk a day in their shoes.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree. I feel that people are being offended for others, that maybe their heart is in the right place, but they don't know anything about the culture that they're claimed to be offended by proxy. And what happens is you get an idea of, we're not allowed to talk about this. I can't question the narrative. It seems like so much of what I'm seeing in the vitriol on Facebook are basic assumptions. I saw this from the Huffington Post. Trump supporters celebrating the ascent of their candidate, a candidate who campaigned by appealing to white heterosexual Christian supremacy. I mean, right away, they're assuming that's the case. And therefore, if you take that assumption, now it's pretty hard to say, yeah, I voted for Trump, because how do you untie yourself from racism? But the folks that voted for him do not see him as a white Christian supremacist. And to allow that basic assumption to stay unchallenged, we can't even start the discussion.
Exactly. I mean, there are myriad reasons why, people would vote for Trump. I mean, economic concerns. So anybody that was, anti-trade or sort of concerned about what globalization is doing to our bottom line and our current accounts, for those people who voted for him for that reason, I mean, they're getting painted in the same broad brush.
Yeah.
They're being called racist. I mean, so we didn't even bother to examine. And you know what? Had we done that, had we actually bothered to examine the reasons why people were voting for Trump, maybe we would have come up with a better candidate to oppose him, right? Like maybe that would lead us to understand what we were lacking on the other side as the alternative.
Right. And I can't resolve how 33% of male Latino voters are somehow Christian white supremacists. Doesn't make sense.
Exactly. Or 50% of college-educated women, which actually was something that did surprise me.
Well, at this point, we will do our weekly myth of the day. Xmas is a common abbreviation for the word Christmas. And X comes from the Greek letter chi, which is the first letter in the Greek word for Christ. There is a common misconception that the word Xmas stems from a secular attempt to remove the tradition of Christ out of Christmas, but its use dates back to the 16th century. The word Christ, including Christmas, has been abbreviated in English for over 1,000 years, long before modern Xmas was used. The X and the P, or the chi and rho, arose as the uppercase forms of those letters in ancient abbreviations for the Greek word for Christ, and are still widely seen in many Eastern Orthodox icons depicting Jesus Christ. In ancient Christian art, chi and rho are abbreviations for Christ's name, and in many manuscripts of the New Testament, X is an abbreviation for Christ. Since at least the 19th century, Xmas has been used in various English language nations. Modern use of the term is mainly limited to advertisements and headlines, where its conciseness is valued. The terms Xtian and Expian have also been used for Christian. The abbreviation of Christmas in Xmas is the source of disagreement among many Christians. Those who dislike abbreviating the word are unfamiliar with the long history of Christians using X in place of Christ. And that is our myth of the day and preparation for Christmas.
Very nice.
I love that because it's people think that the atheists that's our doing. That it's our war on Christmas, that we're sort of taking the Christ out of Christmas, right?
Right. And specifically what you're doing too is pushing atheism or not pushing atheism, but bringing global secular humanism literally globally. And I feel like since America exports so much culture, genes and movies and so much is American, it seems like our own humanism should be liberal and it shouldn't be illiberal. I often hear Trump voters saying, well, that they were just voting selfishly. But Asna Normani said she voted for Trump specifically looking at the Middle East. And it's really good that I think you're allowing this to be global, because it's important to not sell out the secularists in the Middle East. If we get illiberal, they're in big trouble.
Exactly, because that is what happened with this Atheism Plus movement, I think, where people started, sort of that have been the source of regressive leftism in the U.S. because, you have a situation now where the Southern Poverty Law Center has characterized Majid Nawaz and Ayaan Hirsi Ali as people who are anti-Muslim extremists.
Right.
This is one of the biggest travesties, and sort of, I first thought, okay, no, this is just a culmination of the regressive movement, but I don't think it'll be the last one. I mean,
it's a scandal.
It is a scandal.
We've so successfully cast, any criticism of Islam, the idea, as racist, as gross and racist, to quote, Batman on Bill Maher. Partly because we're losing this global, like I said, we are losing the global perspective. If you knew what it was like to be gay in Saudi Arabia or being a woman in some parts of the Middle East, like, why, you would absolutely stand up for these people. And I mean, unless you were, completely okay, being cognitive dissonant and holding two different views, and you're like, one set of values for me and one set of values for you. Right. In which case, people like you and me can say, you know what, you're being racist.
That's true. I mean, that
is what Ali called Ali Rizvi called the lower expectation, the soft bigotry of lowered expectations.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite quotes. And new from the SPLC, I think it was just today or yesterday, released a statement that they were saying 2 pieces demanding from Trump that he publicly disavow all forms of bigotry, which I have no problem with. I think that might actually help. But number 2, assure the country that no one in a hate group or that's advocating an extreme position, like Majid, they claim, shall hold a place or have influence in his administration. And this is the idea of, as long as we put people on lists and then we push it out into the culture, you could effectively stop his administration. I mean, that's a clear political move.
Right, exactly. In fact, I think there was a really great article by Nick Cohen who said the white left has just issued its first fatwa.
Yeah, that was priceless. I did like that quote too. Yeah.
A question: do you think that in some ways, liberals in America or the regressives are the cause of the new administration?
It's really hard to isolate that, but I mean, I can see that it has driven some people who are sort of concerned about PC culture, concerned about being sort of anger at being tarred as a racist, xenophobe, bigot, anti-feminist, chauvinistic person. I mean, this concept of whiteness and especially maleness as privilege at the outset.
Yeah,
that is something that has driven a lot of people to anger, because to be male or to be white now automatically implies that you have oppressed everybody else, and that has really driven a lot of people to I don't know whether that by itself has caused anybody to vote for Trump, simply that reason alone. I'm sure it's one factor. We can't really discount that.
Yeah.
I agree. And that was a bad question, and you answered it well.
It's a factor. I think it's definitely a factor. It's hard to quantify, but I mean, because it says that they're the oppressor, but it also says that they themselves can't be oppressed. I mean, you often see that. I've seen a meme, drinking white tears. I mean, what's that mean? Yeah. Imagine if you flip that to black, how racist and brutal that would be. And yet you don't see it on the other side. This kind of language is what I think is widening the political divide. One of the silver linings I see for a Trump presidency is that finally people are talking again. This is a small sampling on my own Facebook, but people actually trying to listen. How could you vote for Trump? Toning the rhetoric down a little bit to where people will explain, and perhaps something can be gained by that.
Of course. I mean, that's the whole point. I mean, when we sort of shed the identity politics, then you are forced to engage with people just with more humanity, because what's left once you erase all the categories of identities, whether you are, queer or your race, gender, all those lines, once those are gone, like the only thing you can engage on is your common humanity. And that's actually what's been lacking in the past, past couple of years, really. So, Trump's rise has sort of coincided with this increasing rhetoric on SJW rhetoric, really. It's off this notion that we allowed them to redefine what racism was, that racism heard of this. Racism is not just prejudice. That the implication of that being that white people cannot be minorities cannot be racist against white people. There's this notion that, you know, now the reason why, you know, like you said, the drinking, say, like black tears, that's racist, but drinking white tears is not. Is a direct result of this attempt to redefine what racism is.
No, agreed. Absolutely. One of the things that I've heard in the past from some Asian friends and some African American friends in joking when I was in college at Madison was that, you know, who do you think is more racist than white people? And they would say, well, my ancestors, my grandparents who are African American, or my grandparents who are Asian are more racist because they went through the oppression of, you know, World War II and maybe concentration camps for Japanese people, or the inability for African Americans to vote. You know, they would joke that, you know, I believe that they're more racist against white people than they are to us. So, I mean, you can see it both ways. But, you know, again, I just think it's silly to think that there's only one culture and one race in this world that can be intolerant of another.
Well, a couple things to that. Actually, I just learned that Italian Americans and German Americans were also interned during World War II in the United States. We barely hear about it, I suspect, because they're white. And the second thing is that, you know, growing up in Asia, in part like Chinese culture, I think a lot of us immigrants especially, we have we know for sure, like, our people can be racist. And especially, say, like, my Indian American friends, not American Indian, I meant like Indian, subcontinent India Indian, you know, where their culture is still steeped in this caste dominated way of thinking. They absolutely know that their people can be just as, if not more, racist than white people. Russell Peters, the comedian, actually said that one of the most amazing things is that we managed to convince white people that they're more racist than us. And sure, I'm not denying that there are white supremacists in this country. Of course, we can't ignore the fact that, you know, the KKK and members of the KKK have endorsed Donald Trump, who has not rejected, you know, their endorsement. That can't be denied. But on the other hand, I mean, look at the majority of people in this country. To tar them all, and every single one of them that also voted for Trump, as somebody that is, you know, you hear it, literally a Nazi or committed to racial purity and white supremacy, that's not effective. Oh, it really does ignore also that, you know, other people of color can also be racist. Like, it's, and that part, the part where we've just ceded as definition to our social justice brethren, it's very toxic, because
right.
As long as that stands, we're not going to be challenging the racism of people of color. And I don't know whether you've seen it, but since Trump got elected, it has brought out sort of the mirror, right? The other side, where people are saying on Twitter, all you white people, I hate you, or there's a lot of complete anti-white bigotry now, because they're blaming all white people. You know, it's funny, because now if we do the same, if we all came out after every Islamist attack, say the Paris attacks, which, by the way, I think it is the anniversary of the Bataclan and the attack in Paris by ISIS today. If we blamed all Muslims the way they're doing, we'd be called racist, we'd be called bigot, xenophobe, and they're doing exactly the same thing right now. They're basically saying, a lot of people are saying, you know, screw the white people, like, they're the ones that did this, I hate you all. We need to point that out. We need to point out this inconsistency. We can't use racism to fight racism.
And what are your thoughts then in connection to trigger warnings and in safe spaces? I've seen recently in posts, and I've shared myself at one university, where an African American community willfully or requested segregating themselves from the rest of the college community. And in speaking to recently to Matt Dillahunty, he specifically, you know, believes that there's nothing really wrong with the idea of a trigger warning. It just lets people know, you know, out of courtesy, we're about to speak to this. just letting you know, FYI, and now we're going to talk about it. So what are your thoughts on those two aspects?
So the first one on trigger warnings, I think there's two things that make me, two reasons why I push back on it. The first is practical, and the second is philosophical. In terms of the practical, it's that if we took this notion of trigger warnings to its logical conclusion, you basically, I mean, there's no way, as an educator, that you can guess or foretell every possible thing that triggers somebody. It's endless if you were to, be judicious about it. And if you miss it, then that defeats the purpose, right, of a trigger warning, because you just triggered the person. So, and that's just the practical part of it. It seems very difficult and completely unfeasible at some point. And then the second part is just philosophical, that you don't deserve, I mean, there is no right to be offended, to not be offended. There's no inherent right for that. And by encouraging trigger warnings, or at least by not talking critically about it, the problem is that we're feeding this, they call it the special snowflake syndrome, where everybody thinks that, their experiences make them so unique as to render their experience in life reality so fragile. And that is dangerous, because we are going to feed this entitlement, this notion that people are entitled to not be offended. That's my two, if I were to talk with Matt Delahunty about that would be my pushback on why this is ultimately, I think, a bad thing to endorse trigger warnings. And the second one is safe spaces, which is kind of related to trigger warnings. I posted a picture once of me holding a human skull. And I said that this thing right here, this thing that I was holding, this skull head, is the only safe space you need. That's the only place that you can prevent things from getting to you. And of course, I understand that something should be done out of courtesy, but I think that people should still be able to organize together based on certain interests or causes. Like, for example, Black student organizations on campus. Absolutely, these things should exist because there are unique grievances. They need to be able to rally around their unique needs and concerns. So these organizations, they absolutely should exist. There's no problem with that at all. In fact, I would encourage it. But safe spaces in the way that you just described about racial segregation on campus, about housing that is only for Black people, only for people of color. We need a space away from, white people or like the oppressive class. That is something that we need to push back on, because Martin Luther King Jr. is turning in his grave hearing rhetoric like that. I just posted in response to that racial segregation thing in housing. There's actually a movement in South Africa called the Eden Project. And what's happening is the white people there, the Boers, who, were the oppressive class. They were the ones doing the oppressing during apartheid. They are, they're after apartheid fell, a lot of the land that they owned, the farmers, they lost it. There were a lot of murders. So they feel at this point, since the fall of apartheid, that they're aggrieved, that they've been actively kept out of political jobs, or because, they're basically paying for the sins of apartheid. And they are now saying, you know what, since 1997 when it happened, when apartheid fell, and we need our safe space. So we're creating this whites-only living project called, Eden. And we want our place away from the Black people, away from everybody else in South Africa. And I fail to see how you can endorse one but not the other. So either Black students calling for segregated racial housing in the United States is okay or not.
Right, because technically the Boers would be a minority status, at least racially, in South Africa.
And they have claims to being aggrieved.
Right.
In recent history, at least. So, if you're saying, oh, this is awful, like, you would probably see SJW say, like, posting stories about, oh, look, like, these white people want their own enclave. Yeah, but, you're okay with Black students wanting their own enclave too, for illusions of, for feelings of being persecuted somehow, or like historical grievances. It's the same way with right now what's going on in South Africa.
Well, as we get close to the end of our hour here, would you be willing to share with us your new nonprofit, Ideas Without Borders?
Yeah. So we were actually brainstorming about names when Faceall and I first wanted, because, right now Movement exists as an app. It's a mobile app, and it has no home. It is not. It does not come under the purview of a nonprofit. And we have this huge following with the newsfeed, the Global Secular Humanist newsfeed. And we thought maybe it's time to finally parlay all these avenues, because, there's an education outlet, there's an actual app, a web platform that does things. So the question was, is it time to start something that can take everything in-house and make it like a cohesive objective? And so we're brainstorming for names, and we came up with Ideas Without Borders, which is kind of, we thought self-explanatory, sort of piggybacking on Reporters Without Borders and Doctors Without Borders. And what we want to do with this is, it's actually twofold or threefold. The first is countering violent extremism in the Middle East. That is something that is, especially for Faceall, an ex-Muslim or, secular activist, something that's very dear to his heart. And yes, it doesn't appear to be improving the situation with violent extremism. So the question is, it seems to be a high level thing, can the average do? And we thought, okay, you know what, we have the solution. But there's another bigger part, and that's where Ideas Without Borders comes in. The idea that you should be able to commit apostasy, that you should be able to say, I'm reading off my birth. This is something that is an idea, right? The idea of apostasy is something that is quite widespread in the West. Most Christians I know, like if they said, if they told their parents, hey, Mom, I'm no longer a Christian, they wouldn't be executed. They wouldn't be beat up. Their parents would be disappointed, probably at most. At some cases, they might be rejected from the family, outcast. But by no means would they be killed, honor killing or whatever. But this is quite common in parts of the Middle East and other parts of the world, where you have this idea that you can leave your religion of birth is not available to you. So in other words, the idea has a border. It is restricted to some people and open to others. So we liked this concept that if ideas could be open to everybody, universal, freely debated in public, that in the marketplace, where all these ideas can clash, and that will emerge from there. And that isn't just to do with religion or secularism. It also has to do with a lot of PC stuff that we're seeing, right? Like under the same rubric, we can counter this notion that, why should I get pushed back because I think that minorities absolutely can be racist? And it's pushing it back any sense of orthodoxy that trying to push. And hopefully that leads to a world where we're just a lot more open.
Yeah, well, you're definitely contributing to that. So we really appreciate you sharing the time. Your Twitter feed is great. I encourage people to follow you at Ms. Melissa Chen, Chen. You'll get a lot of stuff there, and you write poetically. It's beautiful.
Thank you, Melissa. The future of secularism, human rights, and cultural relativism. It was a pleasure to spend some time with you on the air.
Thank you, Fritz. Thank you, Brian.
Bye.
All right, great. We'll find this interview and find us as well on Stitcher and iTunes, and later uploaded on YouTube. Thank you very much. Have a great day.